My husband thought leaving me for a wealthy mistress was the smartest decision of his life. But little did he know, I had a secret far bigger than hers. Stick with me while I share my story, and if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Emily, and I'm 32 years old. I met Mark when I was in my 20s, and from the very first day, I could tell he had a strong personality. He was charming, funny, and always full of big dreams. He wasn't the type to settle for little things. He wanted the best of everything. At that time, I found it exciting. I thought he was just ambitious and driven, someone who would push both of us to build a good life together. When we first started dating, Mark made me feel like I was the center of his world. He would surprise me with small gestures, like bringing me flowers or leaving little notes. Those moments made me believe he truly cared for me, and I quickly fell in love. Within a couple of years, we got married, and I thought I was entering a happy, stable life with a man who valued love above all else. Mark had his flaws, but I looked past them because I loved him. He always liked being around successful people, the kind who lived in big houses and drove luxury cars. He would talk about them with admiration and sometimes even envy, but I never thought it would become a problem between us. I believed we could create a life that was comfortable and happy without needing to compete with anyone. As our marriage went on, I started to notice how restless he became. He wasn't satisfied with what we had, even though we lived decently and never lacked what we needed. He complained about how small our house was compared to his friends' homes, or how his colleagues were buying expensive watches while he had to settle for something simple. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was just talk, but his dissatisfaction grew with time. Mark often told me that he wanted more out of life, and while I agreed that growth was important, I didn't think happiness should depend on showing off material things. I tried to support him by encouraging his work and staying by his side, but I could feel his attention shifting away from me. He spent more time talking about money and luxury than about us. I told myself he was just going through a phase, but deep down, I knew something was changing. He wasn't the same man I married, the one who once found joy in the simple moments we shared. Instead, I felt like he was chasing a dream that kept pulling him farther away from me. That was the beginning of a reality I didn't want to face, but eventually, I had no choice. When Mark and I first got married, life was simple and honestly a little tough. We started from almost nothing in Dallas, Texas. Our apartment was small, the kind where you could hear the neighbors arguing through the walls, and the kitchen was barely big enough for two people to stand in at once. But we didn't care in the beginning. We had each other, and that was enough to make me feel like we could handle anything that came our way. Mark worked long hours at his job, trying to climb the ladder, while I supported him in every way I could. We budgeted carefully, saving money wherever possible, and dreamed about building something bigger one day. I never complained about what we didn't have because I believed that together we could slowly create a life we'd be proud of. It wasn't perfect, but I thought the struggles we faced were part of what made our bond stronger. What Mark never knew during those early years was that I came from a family with deep roots and old money. My grandfather had built a successful business long before I was born, and much of it had been passed down to my parents and eventually to me. But I made the choice not to share that with Mark. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not for what my last name or bank account could offer. From the beginning, I wanted a marriage built on honesty and affection, not money and greed. So, I played the part of a young wife starting from scratch, and in a way, I wanted that experience. I wanted to know what it felt like to struggle side by side with the man I loved, to build something real with my own two hands rather than having everything handed to me. For a long time, I believed Mark shared that vision. We made do with what little we had, turning hand-me-down furniture into something cozy and cooking meals together to save money instead of dining out. I found happiness in those quiet nights, laughing with him over burnt dinners or watching movies on our old secondhand TV. Those moments felt pure to me, the kind of memories that money could never buy. Sometimes my family would ask if I needed financial help, but I always said no. I thought being independent with Mark would prove that our love was real and unshakable. I didn't want him, or anyone else, to think that money was holding us together. I wanted him to love me for me, not for what he could gain. Looking back, I can see how blind I was to his true nature, but at that time, I believed in our marriage completely. I thought we were two people with one dream, slowly working toward a better future. I had no idea how wrong I would turn out to be. As time passed, the little apartment turned into a modest house in the suburbs. It wasn't huge, but it was comfortable, with a small backyard where I planted flowers and a porch where we sometimes sat in the evenings. To me, it felt like progress. We had worked hard to get there, and I was proud of what we had built together. But for Mark, it was never enough. He started making small comments here and there, and at first I brushed them off. He would point out how one of his coworkers had just bought a brand new car, or how a friend from college had moved into a big 2-story home in an expensive neighborhood. He would say things like, "Why are we stuck here while everyone else is moving ahead?" It hurt to hear those words, but I stayed quiet, convincing myself that it was just frustration and that he'd grow out of it. Over time, those small complaints turned into constant comparisons. If we went to dinner at someone's place, he would spend the ride home talking about how much nicer their furniture was or how he wished we had a kitchen like theirs. When we visited friends, he'd notice the little details like the latest gadgets or new designer clothes, and I could see the disappointment on his face when we came back to our simple home. I tried to remind him of how far we had come together, but it didn't seem to make a difference. It was as if he was blind to the love and effort we had poured into our life. He only saw what was missing, not what we had. I started to feel a distance between us, like he was slowly slipping into a world where appearances meant more than the bond we once shared. The man who used to laugh with me over silly mistakes now seemed preoccupied, distracted, and often irritated. He began to spend more time at work, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be surrounded by people who looked successful. He admired their lifestyles and wanted to be like them. I could see the hunger in his eyes every time he talked about wealth, power, and recognition. I kept telling myself that love would be enough to hold us together. I thought if I stayed patient, if I showed him how much I cared, he would eventually realize that happiness wasn't found in material things. But deep down, a small part of me started to worry. The man I married seemed to be changing, and I didn't know how to reach him anymore. The cracks were there, slowly spreading, and though I tried to ignore them, I couldn't shake the feeling that our marriage was moving in a dangerous direction. I held on tightly, hoping that my love would be strong enough to pull us through, not realizing how close we were to breaking. It started slowly, almost in ways that I tried to convince myself were nothing. Mark began working late more often than usual. At first, he told me he had deadlines and meetings that couldn't wait. I believed him because that's what a wife does, you trust. But after a while, the excuses became too frequent and the hours too long. Nights that once belonged to us were suddenly swallowed by his so-called work. Then came the changes in his appearance. Mark had always dressed neatly, but now he started spending extra time in front of the mirror. He bought expensive colognes and shirts that didn't fit our budget. I questioned him once about the sudden spending, reminding him we were still paying off bills, but he brushed me off with a sharp tone, saying he deserved to treat himself after working so hard. That wasn't the man I knew, and it left me uneasy. Soon after, I noticed gifts appearing that weren't meant for me. A fancy bracelet tucked away in his drawer, a designer handbag receipt crumpled in his jacket pocket. Things I never received. My heart sank when I realized he was spending money we didn't have, not on us, but on someone else. The truth came to me not in a dramatic reveal, but through whispers in the community. Dallas isn't a small city, but word travels fast when it comes to people like Vanessa. She was 30, a divorcee who had kept a large chunk of her ex-husband's wealth and wasn't shy about flaunting it. Everyone knew her for her flashy cars, expensive parties, and the way she enjoyed being the center of attention. And somehow my husband had become one of her newest accessories. When I first heard the rumor, I refused to believe it. I thought, not Mark. He wouldn't do that to me. But denial only lasted so long. The pieces started to fit together. The late nights, the new clothes, the sudden money problems. One evening, when he claimed to be at work, I decided to drive by his office. The parking lot was empty. My chest tightened as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, realizing my gut had been right all along. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I watched him closely, every excuse he gave, every moment he avoided my eyes. The distance between us was no longer just emotional. It was physical. He wasn't mine anymore, not in the way he used to be. Finding out about Vanessa felt like a knife cutting through the life I thought I had. She had everything he craved, money, status, and the lifestyle he wanted so badly. And I was left behind, wondering how the man who once promised me forever could trade our years together for glitter that would eventually fade. That was the moment the truth of my marriage finally hit me. The love I thought would last wasn't enough to keep him from chasing something shinier. The night it all came crashing down was colder than usual, even inside our own home. Mark came in late, his face hard and distant, and before I could even ask how his day was, he looked at me with eyes I barely recognized. He didn't hesitate, didn't soften his words. He told me he was leaving. At first, I thought I had misheard him. My mind tried to protect me, to make sense of what he was saying, but his voice was steady and sharp. He said he had found someone else who could give him the life he deserved. He didn't even bother to hide her name. Vanessa. The name that had been haunting me in whispers and rumors was now spoken directly in our living room, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I stood frozen, my heart pounding so hard it felt like my chest might break open. My world tilted as I listened to the man I had given years of my life to reduce our marriage to nothing more than a stepping stone. He spoke about luxury, status, and how he was tired of living small. His words cut deeper than any knife. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that he had never truly valued me, not for who I was, but only for what he thought I could provide. In that moment, I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to remind him of every sacrifice, every moment of love, every piece of myself I had given to him. But instead, I went silent. I held my ground, swallowing the pain that threatened to spill over. I refused to beg for a man who no longer wanted me. He packed a small bag that night, his actions quick and careless, as if leaving behind our years together meant nothing. Every sound of the zipper closing, every step he took toward the door, felt like another piece of my heart breaking off. I watched him walk out without even looking back, and that silence between us said more than any words could. When the door finally shut, I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling. Tears burned my eyes, but even as they fell, there was a strange clarity inside me. I realized that the man I thought I loved had been gone for a long time. What remained was only a shell of him, a man consumed by greed and illusions. It hurt more than I can put into words, but I knew I had to let him go. Holding on to someone who could discard me so easily would only destroy me further. That night, as the silence of the house wrapped around me, I promised myself I would not chase after him. He had chosen his path, and I would choose mine, even if it meant walking alone. After Mark left, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever, but along with the ache in my chest came a truth he never knew. For years, I had carried a secret that could have changed everything, but I had chosen not to share it. My late grandfather had left me a fortune, money that stretched far beyond what most people could imagine. It wasn't just wealth in the bank, it was investments, businesses, and property that made me financially secure for life. I had lived simply because I wanted to. I never cared about flashing riches or competing with others. My happiness came from love, peace, and living a grounded life. I didn't want a marriage where money was the foundation. I wanted to know that my husband loved me for me, not for the number of zeros in my account. That was why I never told Mark. I wanted him to see me, not my inheritance. Now, he was running straight into the arms of Vanessa, a woman who made her wealth a performance. She flaunted every dollar she had, dressing in designer clothes, throwing parties, and making sure the world knew she was somebody. It was exactly the kind of glitter that blinded Mark. He thought he had found a shortcut to the life he always dreamed of, without realizing that the true fortune had been right beside him all along. There was an irony to it all. He had traded years of loyalty, partnership, and the quiet comfort of a real marriage for a woman who could only offer him an illusion. What he saw in her was only the surface, a display built to impress others, not a stable life built on love or respect. He believed she could give him everything he wanted, while I quietly held more than she ever could. The night he left, I sat alone in our modest house and thought about how easily he had walked away. If I had told him the truth earlier, maybe he would have stayed. But then I realized if money was the only reason he might have stayed, then he was never really mine to begin with. That thought hurt, but it also freed me. I knew my silence had protected me. Because now, while he chased Vanessa's glitter, I still had my inheritance, my independence, and my dignity. He left believing I had nothing compared to her. But in reality, I had everything he ever dreamed of and more. That truth gave me strength. It reminded me that his betrayal wasn't my failure. It was his blindness, his greed, and his inability to see real value beyond appearances. He had chosen his path, and he didn't even realize the price of that choice. And I decided I would never tell him. Let him believe he had upgraded, while the real treasure slipped right through his hands. The weeks after Mark left were the hardest I had ever faced. The silence in the house was unbearable, and every corner reminded me of the life we once shared. Nights felt endless. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, wondering how I could have given so much and still been tossed aside so easily. Some nights I cried until morning, and other nights I felt nothing but anger boiling inside me. But slowly, something inside me shifted. I realized that if I let the pain control me, I would never move forward. I had been broken, but I refused to let that be the end of my story. Instead of collapsing under the weight of betrayal, I decided to stand back up and rebuild my life, piece by piece. I began focusing on what I had always avoided, my inheritance. For years, I had kept it tucked away, untouched, as if it wasn't even mine. But now I saw it differently. It wasn't just money. It was an opportunity to create the life I wanted without depending on anyone else. I invested part of it into my family's businesses, helping expand operations and opening new doors. For the first time, I was making decisions for myself, and it gave me a strength I didn't know I had. Alongside the work, I gave myself a fresh start in other ways too. I moved out of the house that held so many painful memories and into a new home that felt like a reflection of who I was becoming. It wasn't just beautiful, it was peaceful, a place where I could breathe again. Every room felt like a step away from the past and closer to the future I wanted. Still, healing wasn't easy. The loneliness lingered, but I didn't allow it to consume me. I reached out to old friends I had drifted away from during my marriage, people who had always cared for me. I surrounded myself with genuine, supportive people who reminded me of my worth, people who loved me for who I was and not for what I could give. Their kindness filled the empty spaces that Mark had left behind. I also learned to enjoy time alone. I began picking up hobbies I had forgotten, like painting and gardening. Simple things that brought me peace. With each day, I felt lighter, as if the burden of his betrayal was no longer pressing down on me as heavily as before. There were still moments when the hurt tried to creep back in, but I didn't let it win. I chose to see every painful memory as proof that I had survived something meant to break me. Betrayal had left me wounded, but it also pushed me to rebuild a life that was stronger, freer, and entirely my own. For the first time in a long while, I began to feel like myself again. Months passed, and I had begun to feel a sense of peace again. My life was moving forward, little by little, and though the scars of betrayal were still there, they no longer controlled me. Then one afternoon, while I was out having coffee with a close friend, I heard something that made me pause. She mentioned Mark and Vanessa, and the look on her face told me the story wasn't good. I didn't ask at first, but she continued. Vanessa's wealth, the very thing that had pulled Mark away from me, wasn't what it seemed. The businesses she had bragged about were falling apart, and her so-called fortune was slowly slipping through her fingers. The woman who had lived for luxury was now selling off her assets, one by one, just to keep her lifestyle afloat. As my friend spoke, I felt an odd mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to feel pity, but another part couldn't help but see the irony. Mark had left me because he thought Vanessa could offer him a grander life, but instead, he had walked straight into the collapse of everything he chased. I learned that Mark himself was drowning in problems. He had quit his job after leaving me, thinking Vanessa's money would carry him. But when her businesses started failing, the bills piled up. Credit cards, debts, and unpaid loans began to weigh on him. The man who once mocked our ordinary life was now living under the shadow of financial ruin. People whispered about how different he looked. The polished, confident man I once knew had turned bitter and tired. He was seen arguing with Vanessa in public, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Their once glamorous outings turned into messy displays of anger and blame. It was clear the fairy tale he thought he was stepping into had quickly soured. Hearing all of this, I stayed quiet. I didn't share my thoughts with anyone, but deep inside, I understood something important. Mark had never been searching for love. He had been searching for wealth and recognition. And now, without either, he was left with nothing. The downfall wasn't sudden. It was slow, like watching a tower crumble brick by brick. He had gambled his marriage, his stability, and his dignity on the promise of a richer life. But all he gained was disappointment. Vanessa, who once looked untouchable, was now exposed for the unstable foundation she really was, and Mark was trapped in the wreckage. I never reached out to him. There was no need. Life had already delivered the consequences he had chosen for himself. The man who thought he had upgraded was now living a life far worse than the one he had abandoned. For me, It was a quiet reminder that sometimes revenge doesn't have to be planned. It happens on its own. The night of the charity gala was one I'll never forget. It was an event I had helped organize, using part of my inheritance to support causes that mattered to me. The ballroom sparkled with lights, the air filled with laughter and music, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fully myself, strong, confident, and free. I wore a gown that made me feel radiant, not because of its price, but because of the woman I had become since my world had fallen apart. As the evening went on, I moved through the crowd, greeting guests and speaking about the projects we were funding. Everywhere I turned, people treated me with respect, not for my wealth, but for the way I carried myself. I felt proud not of the money I had, but of the strength I had found after betrayal. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw him. Mark. He stood near the entrance, looking smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched and his expression unsure. For a moment, my heart skipped, not out of love, but from the shock of seeing him there. He looked worn down, his suit ill-fitted, his face lined with stress. Gone was the confident man who had once believed he deserved the world. Our eyes met, and I could see the recognition flash across his face. He froze for a second, then slowly walked toward me. As he drew closer, I could see the regret written all over him. He opened his mouth, his voice shaking, and began to apologize. He said he had made a mistake, that he had been blinded, that he realized too late what he had lost. His words poured out like someone desperate to hold on to anything that remained. I listened calm and quiet, letting him speak. The old me might have cried, might have begged for answers, but that woman no longer existed. When he finished, I gave him a small smile, steady and unshaken. I thanked him, not for his betrayal, but for teaching me something I had never known before. I told him that through his actions, I had learned my true worth, that I didn't need anyone who couldn't see my value from the start. His face fell, his eyes wide as if he had expected forgiveness. But I didn't give it to him. Instead, I stepped back, offered him a polite nod, and walked away into the crowd, leaving him standing alone under the bright lights. That moment wasn't about revenge in the way most people imagine it. It wasn't loud or cruel. It was quiet, dignified, and final. By walking away, I showed him that I had already won, not because of money or status, but because I had built a life where his opinion no longer mattered. For me, that was enough. When the gala was over, and I finally sat alone in the quiet of my home, I thought about how far I had come. There was a time when I believed betrayal was the end of everything, a wound so deep it would never heal. But sitting there, I realized it had been the start of something I never expected. A new chapter that was brighter than the life I once clung to. Mark had lost me, the one person who truly loved him without conditions. He had traded loyalty for a shallow promise, and in the end, he had nothing to show for it. I didn't need to punish him, I didn't need to ruin him. Life had already done that, and more importantly, I no longer cared about what became of him. My victory wasn't in humiliating him. It was in the simple fact that I had survived, grown, and flourished in ways he would never understand. What he saw that night at the gala wasn't just wealth or success. It was a woman who had risen from heartbreak and built herself back stronger. I had learned that love isn't enough when respect is missing. I had learned that sometimes letting go is the most powerful choice you can make. And most of all, I had learned that my worth was never tied to how someone else saw me. Every step of my journey after he left taught me something valuable. The loneliness showed me the importance of self-reliance. The anger reminded me that I was capable of standing on my own. The rebuilding proved that I had strength I had never tapped into before. Out of the pain, I found a version of myself I might never have discovered if he hadn't betrayed me. Now my life is full, not because of money or grand houses, but because of peace and clarity. I spend my time on things that matter, with people who love me for who I am. My friendships are real, my work has meaning, and my heart is no longer weighed down by the fear of being left behind. I know what it feels like to be broken, but I also know what it feels like to rise again, and that is something no betrayal can ever take from me. In the end, Mark lost the game he thought he was playing. He believed wealth and status would bring him happiness, but instead they left him empty. I, on the other hand, found something greater than revenge. I found freedom. I found self-respect. And I found a life richer than anything money could buy. That was my closure, my true revenge, and my beginning.